Basically, the short version. Christina started this podcast when she was struggling a lot. She went through a lot. I joined. We both have been up and down and realized that's how life goes.
Hello, friends.
Hello, friends.
And welcome to Pickles and Vodka, the mental health podcast that turns 5 years old today. We are recording on the actual 5-year anniversary of the first episode ever released. And full disclosure, this is our second attempt at recording this episode.
I wasn't going to say it. I was like, because trying to record the day before didn't work.
Yeah, we'll get into it. But first, I'm Christina.
And I'm Lauren.
And we are your two co-hosts of this adventure in vulnerability.
Ooh.
I like the way that Vicky said it that one time.
What did she say? I don't
remember.
Okay, but she said something cool.
Yeah. So we have a lot to talk about. We have a lot of reflections to do. We have some listener feedback to share. But first, I think we should give some personal updates because it's been a hot minute since we did that. Last week, of course, we did a movie review with our friend and listener, Orion. Shout out again. Super fun. But yeah, we didn't really talk about our personal lives on that episode.
We talked about the movie for like 2 hours, so you guys didn't hear all that. Sorry.
So I thought this one we could just start off by getting into how we've been.
Sure.
So Lauren, where are you at today?
I realized as soon as we started this that you were going to put me on the spot first. I don't know, because I just feel like things have just kind of been going, you know, and when you look back and you're like, has it been going well? Meh. Has it been going bad? It's just going.
Well, you told me in a phone call recently that you have been throwing yourself into a lot of new things lately.
Yes.
Some good, some bad, but your life has been very full.
Yeah, so that is quite different for me, and not different in a bad way, I'd say. I have restarted. I've tried a few times to do aerial arts, like on the silks and things like that. The first time that I tried, it was 2019 before I went to treatment, and there were 6 classes and I could only make it to 4 of them. By the 5th one, I was just like, I physically should not be doing this. And by the 6th one, I think I was already in treatment. So that didn't work out so well. I tried it again, maybe like 2 years ago, and it didn't feel right. I just felt kind of like out of it, and like they were playing favorites, and I don't know, didn't like the vibe of the place. So it took me 2 years to try it again. And as soon as I walked in, it felt the exact opposite. I was just like, this place feels perfect. I can see spending time here. My old instructor, actually, from when I originally took classes, was now teaching there, and I love her. So it's been so fun. I have noticed as a big positive is, while something that I think I am struggling the most with now is continued body image and things like that. And surprisingly, because when you're making shapes and the silks and things like that, like obviously you are wearing workout clothes, but specifically they want them to be form-fitting workout clothes. Ugh. And so, so
I just cringed.
Exactly. I haven't even noticed until looking back, knowing in general, I'm like struggling so much with body image. But when I'm at those classes, I'm just like, it's never even crossed my mind. I'm just concentrated on what I'm doing. I want to do better. I want to learn how I can get stronger in certain areas so I can do the stuff that they're doing. And that's amazing, really.
Yeah. Like you said, in the past, when you tried your hand at this, you were in the middle of your eating disorder. And so you were not able to give it the energy or the attention that you really needed to get the benefits out of it.
Exactly. I talked to Christina about this the other day, and I talked to my dietitian about this in our last appointment, because she's been with me for 3 years, we realized at our last appointment. I was like, holy shit. She saw a lot of years where I just could not do anything, didn't have the motivation to do anything, wasn't doing anything. So I think any new thing that I mention, she's immediately going to be supportive because she wants to see this happen. I suggest music and she's like, oh my God, yeah, do it. And I said, I'm kind of feeling like maybe it's time I do that awful thing and try dating again. Because I want the eventual outcome, but God, dating sounds terrible. And she was excited about that too, of course. And that's where I brought up 2 new things in addition to trying to work on the podcast as much as possible and do the aerial stuff. And I said that. I was like, I kind of feel like I might be overwhelming myself though.
Yeah. I mean, especially since it has only been a few months since you got out of treatment.
Mm-hmm.
And we both know how important it is to establish some sort of routine.
And I don't know about you, but for me, there's kind of a fear because, I've never had like a sustained time more than a few months that I've been in a pretty good place. So I feel like if I throw myself into all this stuff now, if I start dating and aerial and music and all this stuff, what if, like has always happened in the past, everything comes back within a few months and then I have to drop all that stuff?
Yeah. I mean, that's always the biggest fear with me too, is at what point will I have to choose? I think that's what we do. We tell ourselves that it's all or nothing. Like we can only be invested in 1 or 2 big things at once. Like for me, I don't know how to spread it out in a healthy way while also remaining dedicated to it.
Yeah, I'm not good at that. And also I am afraid that if I have to like uproot my life again, then it's kind of like, well, if I was only trying to do 1 or 2 things, that's only 1 or 2 people I have to disappoint. Where if I'm trying to do 5 different things, then it's just like everyone.
What do you really, really want to do the most right now? Like, do you feel your heart pulling you towards one thing more than the other?
I'm taking it slow, but of the 2 that I suggested, I really do want to see if I can get involved in music again.
I think that would be fantastic for you.
Yeah. The dating thing got in my mind, but I think because initially it sounds so awful that I have no problem with putting that aside for a while.
Yeah, I don't even want to touch dating on this episode, but
good.
That's a whole
good.
Yeah, that's a whole thing. In the past, when I have dated in early recovery, it's been a bad decision.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I think, the same thing. And I think possibly I didn't have as many other things then that I was as excited about. So I did because, like I said, I want the end result. And I knew that. And I was just like, I'm sick of waiting. And I'd go out, and it would not be the best decision.
I think we're so fixated on end results. Like, we do fixate on what we're going to get out of something. Like if it's a relationship, we're so busy thinking about the person that we can be if we meet that person that we don't even think about the process. We forget to focus on the actual process. And like for me, living in the moment is the hardest thing ever.
Yeah. And honestly, for me, that is one of my issues. It's gotten frustrated because I feel now that we just pretty much exclusively online date, that's been everybody's aim. I feel like I see people and they're just kind of like, well, if you don't want the exact same future with me, then there's no point in me answering you. And I'm like, when we used to meet our people organically, you didn't ask all that stuff up front.
Yeah.
And sometimes it still worked out.
I'm just done with online dating in general.
Fair.
Dating hasn't even been on my mind at all.
That's probably good. Let's segue into where you at. Speaking of.
You're done talking about your personal life?
Well, it just seemed like such a good segue. Why you shouldn't be dating.
I haven't been doing the best. I don't know how much I want to talk about today, but it's been hard to like show up for a lot of things lately. Mm-hmm. Speaking of getting involved in too many things and then burning out, I think about a month ago, I was really involved in my activism and, my community and, trying to do things every day of the week towards that. And all the while I was dealing with my depression and my eating disorder. And it's at the point now where those latter things have forced me to take a step back from the causes that I was so passionate about. And it's been really shitty to see that happen to me without being able to like really do anything about it.
But I think that's a common thing too, is that sometimes we try to get involved in things so much because then we don't have to think about the other things that are going on.
Yeah. It's been a real blow to my self-worth because, I don't know, I think for the last few months or even the last year, if I'm being honest, it's been hard for me to even like show up on this podcast without overwhelming myself or getting flustered because it's not perfect. I mean, in preparation for this episode, I was listening back to some of our older anniversary type episodes.
Mm-hmm.
I was listening to our in-person episode 110 that we did with Vicky in St. Louis.
Yeah.
And of course, we had to cut out a whole segment of that episode because I wasn't adequately prepared. And that's just been happening a lot lately. And I know that the listeners don't care, but I mean, I feel like I have to talk about it because this is an episode of reflection.
Yeah.
But yeah, it all comes down to, I think, being unwilling to live in the moment. I feel like that's the pitfall of these online spaces, is that we have the facade of being in control. Like, it feels like we should be more in control of this space. But if I'm being honest, like, that's never what it's been about.
What, I feel like this is a question that gets asked a lot, is like icebreaker or something like that. What was your answer when people asked if you could have any superpower? What would it be?
Shape-shifting or invisibility.
Okay. I just wondered because mine was always stop time. And that's so I could just, and that was mainly my thought, is so I could, like, anything that I was doing, like, I can stop and I can make it perfect. I don't have to worry about like time running out to do that. Yeah.
Oh man, that's a good one. Yeah, I feel like, sorry, I'm looking at that line again.
I have it pulled up. I'm just trying not to let myself look at it.
Yeah, see, this is what happens. I have all this stuff I want to talk about, and then I don't know where to start. So we were talking about me.
Yes.
I was also listening to our 100th episode.
Okay.
So the reason that we couldn't record yesterday was because I had this whole thorough timeline of the podcast that I wanted to go over. And now I realize, like, we don't really need that because we've done it before. We've talked at length of why this podcast came to be and how we both ended up here. I don't think we need to go over that again.
I agree. I as you're saying that, I'm like, maybe that's why that wasn't working out so well, because it was just kind of us rehashing again. And on top of that, Meatball was trying to scale my clothes. They were hanging up and other things. I was going to kill him.
Yeah.
Basically, the short version. Christina started this podcast when she was struggling a lot. She went through a lot. I joined. We both have been up and down and realized that's how life goes.
Exactly. Our 100th episode, for instance, was almost unusable because we had like background noise the whole time. And I mean, we actually did say a lot of things on that episode that made me think. So around the 35-minute mark, we were talking about how we have the tendency to deflect anything serious with humor, with jokes.
Yes.
And I think we have gotten a lot better about that, but it remains something that we're aware of. And you even said, like, I feel like we land on these conversations sometimes that we need to stick with, but instead we talk about it for maybe 5 minutes and then we move on.
Okay.
And then you said that you might want to make an episode about that in the future.
Oh.
And I think it's notable that we keep coming back to that. Like I was saying, even like I've been doing this for 5 years, and podcasts are great because you can kind of make it whatever kind of space you want.
Yeah.
But even after 5 years in this space, I think I still struggle to use it as it was intended. And I know you're more of a newcomer to the podcast, but I know you have your own vision for what you want this space to be.
Honestly, when I joined, because of like what you were doing, I assumed that it was mainly an interview type podcast. And we didn't do interviews for a long time. And honestly, I prefer, like, I love that we've started doing interviews again. I think that's a great way to add some life in and get some other opinions and things like that. But I liked that when I started, we didn't do interviews for a while and it kind of turned into something else. I like that.
Yeah. And that is one thing that has been constant over the lifespan of the podcast is just how it's been changing the whole time. Like, I don't think it's ever been a single type of podcast.
It's always been a podcast focused on mental health. That's all it has to be.
Yeah. And I know, like, we talk about vulnerability a lot. It's kind of become a buzzword, but what does that actually mean? And like, how can we keep cultivating it on our own show when we struggle to sit with it for more than 5 minutes? Like, that's what I've been asking myself.
Yeah, that's interesting. I did not remember saying that back in the 100th episode, but that's an interesting thing to think of.
Yeah. I mean, we know that vulnerability is a practice, and we're really good at documenting our own vulnerability. That's all we do on this podcast. I guess I'm feeling a lot of imposter syndrome with this particular anniversary. Okay, it's because of a post I saw about 5-year plans earlier today.
Okay, let's get into this.
Yeah, so I saw a post, and it was actually a really wholesome post. It was like, my 5-year plan is just spending time with my friends and telling them how much I love them and hanging out.
Aww.
But like, it got me thinking about 5-year plans in general, and how much of a big deal 5 years of anything is.
Yeah, thinking where you were 5 years ago.
Yeah. And where I was 5 years ago, I was 26. I was alcoholic. I was bulimic. I was suicidal. I was on the verge of moving across the country by myself. And I had the idea to make a podcast. And, for some reason, and with your help, obviously, the podcast is still around today. But I still don't know if I feel like I'm setting out to do what I wanted to do then.
But that's okay.
Yeah, that's not a bad thing. But I think when we talk about any sort of anniversary, I think there is a lot of pressure to kind of be like, this is what I've achieved. This is how we're succeeding.
No, I can see that. But at least in this case, it seems like even if you look back and say like, wow, I'm not sure that I accomplished what I wanted to 5 years ago at this point, but you have accomplished things that you weren't even aware of at that time. It's like, I didn't accomplish that maybe, but I accomplished something else with it.
I mean, yeah, I don't like to think about the person I was when I made this podcast. And I don't like to listen to those really early episodes either, because in some ways it seems like it's a different person.
That's fair. I hadn't thought of this before when we were talking about like looking back, because I was like, oh, I've only been here for 1.5 years. I'm thinking of that time. But you just got me like with this conversation thinking of where I was at the time you were starting. And I'm like, oof, I'm glad I wasn't a co-host then.
Well, tell me. Yeah. So 2018, where were you?
Basically, it was the same time that I was just talking about with the aerial classes, because I figured, I said it led up to a time going into treatment, and that time was March 2019. So, I probably started the class around this time, 2018. I had nothing, it felt like, in my life. I had recently moved from a roommate situation because I had just moved to St. Louis. And at that point, it was just like a big move and I needed one to share the expenses. And so once I was able to afford on my own and she was moving out, then I just found a place on my own. But I knew at the same time that I was moving, kind of like you talked about yesterday. I was moving to get away from people, to be by myself, and to be allowed to completely self-destruct with nobody seeing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting that that's where we both were at that point in time, even though we didn't know each other, even though you weren't even involved with the podcast yet. And then, of course, I was just trying to think, like, how many times between the both of us have we been to treatment since this podcast started?
Yeah, so I have, I wasn't involved in it all those times, but I have been 3 times since it started, I guess. Gross. Sorry.
You're fine. Yeah, I went twice since this podcast started. And I can't even tell you how many therapists I've had.
Oh, God, same.
I guess we were talking about how we've changed since the podcast started.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of want to talk about what we've learned, what we think has gotten better since you started the podcast, since we've been doing it together, what we want to do differently in the future. And then we can talk about some listener feedback and answer some questions.
All right. You start this time.
Yeah. So what I've learned overall from doing this for 5 years is that nothing matters. Honestly, like the things that I'm worried about in the moment are never the things that actually matter in the long run. I don't know.
No, that's a good one.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a very private person and I've not always been good at saying the things that I want to say. And so I think starting this podcast was an effort to get better at that.
Mm-hmm.
And in many ways, I've succeeded. But for every piece of me that I reveal through this podcast, there's 5 more pieces of me that I keep hidden. And honestly, 5 years is nothing. Like in terms of my recovery and my personal growth, 5 years, like that is another thing I've seen is that these toxic patterns in our lives are so deeply embedded. Our external circumstances can change a myriad of times, and we will still end up in the same exact places that we were before, like until we really focus on the hard things that are inside us.
Yeah, that's actually, I know I always like process my therapy here, it feels like, but there's like some good things coming up and related to what you're saying. And that was something else I said in my recent appointment. Even when I know all the reasons, like in particular, like going back to the eating disorder behaviors, why it doesn't do what you think it's going to do. Like I've been at this how many years? I know that life isn't better when you're thinner. That's not how it works. But because that's just become my pattern and my go-to, I was saying, like I've talked about the girl that started kind of like helping with my job when I was gone for 3 months and who they kept on and they kind of lifted up as like, she's great. And if you can't get along with her, you're gone. Like I feel kind of like intimidated and threatened by her in general. And she is coming next week to our Christmas party because she works out of Chicago, 5 hours away from us. And so we've never met her in person. And this is going to be the first time meeting her in person. And my instant thought was just like, I want to do what I can to look as good as I can mostly because I feel like I've tried to show, that I am as good as her or to equal her in like performance. And I don't seem to be getting a response by that. So I feel like I've tried to do what I can there and that doesn't work. I know that I can change my looks and I can feel superior.
Oh my God. I feel like you just called me out on something too.
Well, that's why I brought it up because it seemed to go along with what you were.
Yeah. Oh man. I mean, okay, we've been talking a lot about how we both want to get more serious about the podcast, but something's holding us back. I mean, obviously we are both mentally ill people who are actively struggling. And so it's not always easy to give this project the attention that we want to.
Yeah, it takes a lot for us to get through daily life, and we're trying to add other things.
But I just realized when you were talking about that, like maybe I think a lot of my insecurities about not being able to grow the podcast, like I think I'm worried that we've hit a plateau and that I no longer have what it takes to move it to the next level. And so instead of working on that, I've been going back to struggling with my weight and with food. And it's like, is that just a distraction?
Yeah, it's
obviously.
Yes, but yeah, the idea of like the devil you know versus the one you don't.
Yeah. And like, even since you've come on the podcast, like we've been struggling this whole time. And I think it's really easy to see patterns, like repeating the toxic coping mechanisms and like repeating these lapses, even if we know better. We've talked about that a lot, but like we've also talked about, we are capable of change.
Yeah. I don't think I even realized so much until like you've pointed it out a few times, because I've only been here for about a year and a half, and you're just like, wow, you like, I've seen changes in you since then.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, that seems like a short amount of time to like I wouldn't think, have I changed in a year and a half? No. And you say that and I look back and I'm like, she's kind of right.
Yeah. Your views on recovery, I think, have changed. The amount of effort that you were willing to even use to explore recovery.
True.
Like you weren't even willing to look into it, or maybe you didn't feel like you could. But yeah, in the last 6 months alone, you've gone to treatment. You've stuck with a treatment team, even though you've wanted to quit multiple times.
Mm-hmm.
And you've continued in your recovery, even though you've been dealing with a lot of personal barriers on and off the podcast.
Yes.
And I'm really fucking proud of you.
Oh, thank you.
And I am proud of myself too. And I am proud of this podcast. I guess it doesn't feel right to say that in this moment, which is why I'm struggling so hard, I think.
For me, I want to jump on like pretty much something that you said, because you talked about like a chance to be vulnerable. And I 100% agree with you that I feel like I am able to be more vulnerable here. And I found like it kind of like gives me a little space where I can. But I also agree with you that that doesn't mean that I do it a lot. There are a lot of times that I'm still hiding things. So I just thought of the phrase, I'm like, really, this has given me a chance to practice vulnerability.
Yeah. And that's the thing. I think we're never going to master it. Like vulnerability is something you never perfect. Not only can you never perfect it, but I think if you stop doing it for any amount of time, then you can regress and you can lose those skills.
I could see that.
Do you feel like we've been practicing it on the podcast enough since you got on? Like, how do you feel like your practice with vulnerability has changed?
I think that I can, when I look back, yes, see improvement, but also, like you said, nowhere near perfect. We're still holding back a lot. So I just think that I feel like we're doing the right thing, that it's just kind of like, yeah, keep at it. It's going to still be uncomfortable. Keep doing it.
Yeah. No matter how long you do something, even if it's 5 years, it can still be uncomfortable. And there's always room to practice more. I think that's what this whole project is teaching me, is that there's never a shortage of things to learn about yourself and about other people.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, doing this podcast with you is so different from doing it alone. Like, that's been a huge learning curve for me in a good way.
Well, good, because I don't want to go anywhere.
I don't want you to go anywhere. Yeah. Hopefully, we're not going anywhere by choice anytime soon. But yeah, I'm really excited to see where it goes. And I am scared and uncomfortable most of the time. I think I just want people to know that is not necessarily an unhealthy place to be, as long as you're upfront about it.
Yeah, I've said it before, but I give you a lot of credit knowing that you edit all the episodes, because I just always think if I had to, just the total stress that would be, because it'd be the things we talked about. I'd be like, I feel responsible for making it sound perfect.
Well, I do. And that is another thing. If you go back and listen to a lot of the earlier episodes, the sound quality is shit. I am self-taught with a lot of this stuff. And it's really important to me that we make a good sounding show. But I think sometimes that does get in the way of being vulnerable when I'm worried about how it's sounding. It's just something I have to be aware of.
My experience in listening to other people's podcasts, and some people that aren't so great at the sound and some people that are, is pretty much it does not take away from the podcast at all for me, as long as it's not distractably bad. And I think we are well past that.
Well, that's good. That's all I want at the end of the day, to not be distractedly bad.
Yeah.
I'm sure we'll get into more of our feelings later, but for now, do you want to move into some listener feedback?
Yeah. And I'd actually like to start with the one that I shared with you yesterday, because it's not necessarily related to our 5-year, but it is related to like recent episodes.
I was hoping you would.
Yeah. A friend of mine from this last time in treatment, have not heard from her in a long time. It's probably mostly my fault because I'm terrible at keeping up with this stuff. But she randomly texted me for the first time in, like a month. and said, I wanted to say thank you for your podcast episode about rock bottom, because after listening, I brought that to my therapist and was able to talk about it, which was really helpful. I love listening every week. And it was like an out of the blue message. And it was like taking a specific thing that we talked about and saying that helped me. And it was such a great message to get.
I've been thinking about that ever since you initially shared with me yesterday. And it is so humbling. Like we were talking earlier about how the purpose of this podcast was for us in the beginning.
Yeah, I was just doing it to hear myself talk, even though I hate my speaking voice.
We do this podcast because we are two people who feel disconnected. At the end of the day, we feel disconnected in the world because of the stuff that we deal with. And so first and foremost, this podcast is a place for us to talk about the ways we feel disconnected. And if more people can relate, then that's amazing. But I never presume that anyone is getting anything out of this. And so when people message us and tell us that they are, I never know how to react except with immense gratitude. Thank you so much for that message, whoever you are.
We'll just call her T.
T, we love you, T. And yeah, if you ever have any thoughts about our episodes, please send them in. We really appreciate it. So we also asked on Instagram if people had any favorite episodes or moments that they wanted to share, and we got a few responses. Mm-hmm. We got a response from our listener, Madeline, who said that...
This one made me so happy, what she chose.
Yes, so she said, the pets episode, which was episode 93, I identified so much, especially with wondering if I'm underfeeding my cat or if she looks bigger one day. One time she had a late morning vet appointment and I told her not to eat too much because she would be getting weighed later. I still feel like a moron about that. For anyone who hasn't heard that episode, that is the episode where we introduced all of our pets. Mm-hmm. And we talked about the effects that they have had on our mental health and how our own mental health struggles have interfered with being good pet parents, which was what Madeline was referring to.
For the record, I don't know that we necessarily were being bad pet parents. I think we just might have been like paranoid about it because like we're bringing our own stuff into it. Hopefully all of our pets are well taken care of.
Yeah, I think that the moment we were discussing was when you don't know how to feed yourself and you're trying to feed your cat the right amount and you don't know like what a right amount of food looks like.
Yeah.
Yeah. Good times. But yeah, thanks Madeline for responding to that. Mm-hmm. Do you want to read what Vicky said?
Vicky said, my most favorite episode was getting to be the videographer last Christmas, which is number 110. It was awesome to meet Christina and hang out together. My second favorite episode was the one that I was a guest on. That is number 135. Not because of me or for anything I said, of course. That's us deflecting. But just getting to be part of the process was super fun. Lastly, I'll say that I love listening because it helps me keep up with Lauren. Although we live just an hour apart and see each other monthly for our Dungeons and Dragon nights and at other times, we're both pretty busy and I'm not at all good keeping in touch by text, let alone actual phone calls. So listening gives me a chance to find out how she's doing. Many times something I heard on the podcast has prompted me to reach out to her, which is a good thing because we all need to know we're worth reaching out to and we all need that interconnectedness.
How did that make you feel?
That made me feel great. That was another thing, like you said, where it was just kind of like, I didn't even realize that continuing to do this was accomplishing that. That's so cool that she uses it as a way to see, like, how are you doing when we can't necessarily get in touch with each other as much as we'd like. And it just made me feel like, oh, people care.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That has been like meeting Vicky was one of the highlights for me. Like that episode where we met in person was a highlight for many different reasons. Obviously, it was our first time meeting in real life after being internet friends for a couple of years and co-hosting a podcast together for several months. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, that was my first time meeting a listener in real life. I mean,
you didn't already know.
Yeah, that I didn't already know. First time meeting someone who had heard the podcast, but who I had never met. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, that was just a really nice reminder to me that people do listen and that this is an actual community that we've built.
Yeah.
I know we mention this every time we talk about the podcast, but the community is truly the best part of all of this.
Yeah, like our other comments other than Vicky are people that, I do not know in any way. I don't know how you know them, but it's like their names I recognize because they've had involvement. They've left voicemails or comments before, and it's just kind of like, I know these listeners, even though I don't.
Yeah. I asked my brother Andrew, too, which episode was his favorite. And he said he liked the one with the guest who explained a lot of things about BPD. That was episode 10 with my friend M. And he said before that, I never really understood it. The reason I bring this up is because I think the podcast can be a really good tool for learning about struggles that you don't have personal experience with.
Mm-hmm.
And in the past, interviewing guests was a great way to kind of provide a different perspective. And I would love to keep doing that in the future.
That's what I was going to say, is in particular, I think that's where we really benefit from having guests on, is you hear a different perspective. And
Yeah. So if you would like to be a guest in the future, hit us up. If you have something you'd like to talk about, we would love to hear it. And odds are someone else out there would love to hear it too.
I don't know if we want to get into our favorite episodes now. One of my favorites for sure is the one that I guested on. That was number 44. And that was a big reason that I like that. Like, not because it's me, but because I came to you with the topic of saying, like, you've talked about all these different mental health issues. How about the struggles and the blockades of navigating health insurance? And how it can screw you over and how it can contribute even to like some of these issues. Because I feel like that doesn't get talked about as much. And I thought it was an important issue to address. And so
totally.
Yeah.
If there's one thing this podcast has shown me, it's that there's no shortage of topics to cover. Like, I was legit worried about that when I started out. I was like, I'm going to run out of stuff to talk about. I'm going to run out of people who want to talk about mental health, which sounds ridiculous now that I say it. Yeah, that episode that I did with you when you were a guest, I remember struggling with that episode because you challenged me in a good way.
Oh.
I remember wanting to end the episode on a positive note.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, because up until that point, I was still figuring out how to interview and stuff. And I was under the impression that I had to end every episode with a lesson or something positive. And
a G.I. Joe moral.
Yeah. And you flat out said, like, what did you say?
I don't remember exactly, but I mean, I know the time that happened. And yeah, that was at a really like low time for me. So I wasn't feeling positive about anything, and I didn't have a positive. And I was just like, I'm just going to be real, because I can't do that.
Yeah. I think there's a big part of me that wants everything to wrap up in a neat little positive bow and make sense. I want everything to make sense. But this podcast has shown me that it doesn't always make sense. Sometimes the point is just to document it. It doesn't have to make sense.
Yeah, I agree.
One of the most impactful episodes for me, it was shortly before your episode as a guest. It was episode 30. The best bad option, where I interviewed my friend Mara about her addiction and suicide attempts. And that episode was the first time I was really exposed to the idea of harm reduction. I remember the way that she spoke about her addiction was, I had never heard anyone talk about it that way before, not from a place of recovery, not even from a place of remorse, but just like matter of fact, like, this is something that I'm struggling with. She was open with the people in her life about it. And I just had never really heard about that before. And now, all these years later, that is such a huge part of my personal value system, is harm reduction.
Yeah, we did a whole episode on it.
Yeah. And so the point is, I feel like the guests over the years have really shown me a lot and have influenced the direction that these conversations go in, and the direction that they're going to continue to go in the future. Like, as we talk about the future, I think it's clear that we need to keep making ourselves uncomfortable, and we need to keep challenging our perspectives, because otherwise we just fall into this rut where we just keep repeating the same things over and over again.
Yeah. What I made note of is a couple of my other favorite episodes, and I don't have the numbers written down. The one where we were supposed to interview my friend Stacy, who, by the way, still needs to happen.
Yes. Stacey, we're waiting for you.
Yes.
We should probably actually reach out to her again.
That's true.
Anyway.
But that one, we struggled to make it happen, and she couldn't hear us or something like that. And we just couldn't do it. So we just decided to just record on the fly. And that one, and also the first one that we recently did on a weeknight, because both of those, we came in with no plan. We're just going to wing it. We're just going to have fun. And we did. But I think on both of them, we joked about it. We're just like, oh yeah, an episode about, nothing, and us just having fun and no, plan or anything like that. Look how long it takes for us to talk about death or to talk about something serious. That it's we still got into really good stuff, I feel like. Yeah,
I think in those moments when we are able to detach ourselves from our expectations, at least for me, that is when I think I truly shine the most. But it doesn't feel like I am in the moment. In the moment, it feels like I'm floundering when there's no plan.
Well, and especially that's scary. The first one that I mentioned, we just went into it saying do we want to record anyway? We had zero plan. We were going to talk about vapes. That's all we knew.
Yeah. Oh God.
It's that one.
But sometimes not having a plan is the best plan. It's finding that balance that's difficult. And that's something that we continue to work on.
Yeah. We're not perfect. We're just your co-hosts.
No. Again, I'm trying to think of anything to wrap up with, any moments.
You're doing it again.
I know. Oh my God, I'm doing it again. One question that my sister asked me that I've been avoiding answering this whole time is, when you think about who you were when you started the podcast, do you think you would be surprised by where you ended up?
Ooh.
And I think that's good to answer for both of us. And I think the reason it's so painful to think about for me right now is because when I was 26, I had so many dreams, and I was not in a place to start pursuing those dreams, but I was still kind of had the delusion that everything would be okay and that this would kind of be a phase.
Yeah.
And that as long as I just kept pushing forward, I would come out on the other side and things would be better. And in many ways, that's kind of happened. I mean, for one thing, we've reached the other side. Mm-hmm. Whatever that looks like we're here, we're still talking into a microphone about our trauma every week. But personally, I'm nowhere near where I thought I would be. Over the span of this podcast, I have started and ended multiple relationships. I've started and ended multiple jobs. I've moved several times, and I came out as queer this year, and I got diagnosed with ADHD, and my whole world is currently being reshaped around those new identities. And I don't know what the fuck is happening.
Yeah, both of those things are fairly recent. So it's fair to say that it's you don't even know the full impact yet. You're
I don't
still
know
living
the full
it.
Impact. Exactly.
Yeah.
And I hope that this podcast will continue to document the discoveries that I make about myself. I know it's not going to be pretty. It's going to be painful and messy, but I think I'm okay with that.
Good.
And that's kind of where I see the podcast heading in the future, is just continuing to document the journey, whatever the fuck that means.
Yeah. I mean, that's, in my time here, that's kind of what I've seen as one of its main purposes, or the animals.
It's okay. We're wrapping up.
Okay.
But yeah, to answer the question, I think my past self would be proud of me for surviving to this point, and also for not settling for what I know. I'm continuously asking the tough questions, even if I don't like the answers. And I'm proud of myself for that.
Good.
What about you?
I feel kind of the opposite of you, because I remember being, mid-20s or so, and thinking okay, but in a few years, I'm going to be over this and things are going to be better. And I feel like that's a common age to be thinking that kind of stuff. So I'm not surprised. 5 years ago, even, then I would be late 30s. And at that point, I felt beaten down by everything. And so I was coming more with the idea of just nothing does change. Just accept this is your life forever. So the fact that, to some degree, I still feel like that. I feel like my thoughts are never changing and I always go back to the same stuff. But being able to see the things that have changed is like, oh, wow. I thought that I was just like stuck in this life that I'd been in forever. And I mean, within the last year, I'd say, is the first time in my life that I've actually felt like I think I can 100% say I feel financially secure. That's
amazing.
Big
That's
thing.
huge.
Yes. Yeah.
And we don't talk about that on the podcast as much, but it's a big deal. And I think that is directly tied to your mental health and the progress you've been making, even in the last year and a half, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, like that's the other thing, is being able to see the things, like you said, that change, that it's like I had been for years convinced that it's just like, recovery is for other people, not for me. And now, I'm not confident that it will happen, that I won't just like go back like I always do, but it does at least feel like, okay, but I can see it's possible.
Yeah.
That's a thing.
That's the thing. You can't deny listening to this podcast over the last year and a half, how far you've come. And I could say that for me too. Like, I have had multiple relapses while making this podcast, and each time I have come back to recovery and documented it all. And like you said, maybe that will keep happening as long as we keep making this. But I think that's the point, to just show that it happens and that we can get through it, and that you need to talk about it while it's happening.
Yeah, I feel like that's part of what we provide here that, a lot of other mental health focused podcasts maybe don't. They might be more like, I am on the other side and I want to tell you how great it is. And we're just like, we're in it.
We're never we're never on the other side.
Yeah.
Maybe we never will be, but like, that's just
But I feel
life.
like that's how we do good for people. Like that's a lot of the comments we get, is because we're stuck in it, and they're like, "Oh my God, you understand?" Like, yeah, we do.
We understand all too well. And if you understand, let us know. Tell a friend about this podcast. We haven't said that in a while, but word of mouth is really huge for us.
Mm-hmm.
And if all you do this week is tell a friend to listen, I don't know. I'm bad at this.
You're great.
You're great. Yeah. And you can follow us on social media. Well, do we have anything else we want to say before we wrap this thing up?
I don't think we're missing anything.
I still feel nervous.
Unless we want to talk about potential collaboration.
Oh, yeah. Before we wrap this thing up, we want to emphasize again that we are always looking for guests. We're always wanting to hear your thoughts. At the end of this episode, Lauren will tell you how you can follow us on social media. We love hearing from you. We have a few exciting guests planned in the future. Still trying to get unfocused writers on.
Yeah,
that's not what they're called. We're still trying to collaborate with the Unfocused Writer podcast. Yeah.
That is something that I am very excited about. And if anybody listens to us that has their own podcast and wants to do a collaboration, I love that idea. Like, as much as interviews, I love the idea of sharing.
Yes. That's another thing. I wish more people that we knew would start their own podcasts. If you're listening and you're like, should I start a podcast? Yes. The answer is yes. Even if you don't know what you're doing, the world needs to hear your voice.
There's your homework. If you can only do a little bit, please tell a friend. If you feel like you can do a lot, start a podcast.
Yeah. Anything in between is acceptable also.
Yes.
That's all I have.
All right. Here is the ways that you can reach us on social media.
Yes.
You can find us on Instagram at Pickles and Vodka Podcast. You can email us at picklesandvodkapodcast@gmail.com. If you are on Facebook, you can find us at Pickles and Vodka, a mental health podcast. Also, YouTube at Pickles and Vodka Podcast. And if you would like to reach us at our personal Instagrams, they are xtinajumper and at xtinajumper and at Pico Suave, PICOSAUVE, because your co-host cannot spell. Thank you.
Yep, that's us.
Yep.
Hit us up anytime, seriously. We might be late to respond and we're awkward as fuck.
Oh, but I mentioned to Christina, I mean, I've always had access. I am actually trying to go on to our Pickles and Vodka Instagram more often and check out comments and things like that, because I just was lazy and let her do that for months. And I've kind of realized, I could do that too,
Yeah, so Lauren is in there, y'all.
Yes. So you might hear from me too. It's not just Christina. We are one pickles and vodka entity.
I was going to say entity.
Yes.
We love hearing from you. We'll be back next week with more vulnerability and maybe some guests.
Yeah.
Until then, please stay safe and as sane as you want to.
Yeah.
Bye for now.
Bye.